Good evening and welcome to our program this evening, Abolition, Can It Be a Reality? Thank you for joining us today. My name is Brandy Fisher. I am the founder and president of the Alliance for Police Accountability, and I am here to welcome you in the room today. I just wanted to briefly give you an update on all things APA. Tonight is normally our community meeting. And most of you expect updates on what we're doing and what's going on. And so we wanted to provide a brief update to let you know about some of the programs that we have been offering. First, I just wanted to give you an update on our Reimagined Public Safety Coalition. Many people were aware that we completed a vision, what some refer to as a report, about how we would reimagine public safety in Allegheny County. And you should see that link. Feel free to read the report and share it. But we wanted to make sure everybody was aware, in case you were wondering what's happening, that we do plan to have an implementation phase. We will reconvene in October, and we plan to launch our implementation phase in January. And so the things that you read in this report, the things that you see in our vision, we plan to implement, and we plan to do that in 2022. I also wanted to give a brief announcement about an art contest that we have. You may have seen the flyer floating around social media. It is a youth art contest for ages 12 to 19. It is a first prize of $250, a second prize of $150, and a third prize of $50. These are cash prizes for your youth from the ages of 12 to 19 to present art, whether it is visual, written, poetry, raps. We want any art that is reflecting on social justice, activism, or how you see the world that you live in. So please spread the word. If you would like any information, contact us. But we are excited. We have a lot of submissions already. They are awesome. Wait till you all see these things. And we would encourage more people to submit. And lastly, I just wanted to thank you for joining us tonight again. And I wanted to take the time to introduce our moderator for the evening, Justin Lang. You may know more from the arts world, but Justin Lang has been very instrumental in helping us with our Reimagined Public Safety Report. He was our facilitator during that entire process. He was also the co-writer with Jesse Wozniak of the report itself. And he is here tonight to moderate this panel. And we are so grateful to have him. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Justin Lang. from Hillombo. Thank you.
Great. Well, yeah, I'm great. It's great to be here and to be able just to be a part of the conversation. We have some really powerful folks who are going to be sharing, I think, a lot of lived experience as well as analysis, ways to apply it around this whole idea of abolition and abolitionism that I think is underlying when we hear things like defund the police, and we're hearing these ideas that we really saw even become more visible in the uprisings in response to the murder of George Floyd. And so the question I think that many of us have is, how would that look? What would it mean to abolish police, abolish incarceration and these kinds of systems? And so I think tonight we're going to get a chance to be able to hear that, but then also ask questions, which we hope you'll do and fill in the chat. I wanted to share a little bit from the Reimagine Public Safety in Pittsburgh and Allegheny County, that project that I was able to work on that was convened by the Alliance for Police Accountability and One Hood. The report starts off with this, I think, one critical stat, which is that for every dollar a white man makes in Pittsburgh, a Black woman makes 54 cents. And as I, understand the abolitionist framework, and I'm still learning, and that's why I'm excited to even hear today, that relationship between Black people generally, really embodied by Black women, and white people generally, you can really see in white men, is the explanation. That difference is the explanation for police and for incarceration. That something has to hold that relationship. Someone has to keep that relationship together, and it couldn't be done without violence and force. And so I really want to invite people to look at that vision, because it talks about new visions in areas of mental health, in homelessness, in drug use, in violence in neighborhoods. Gives some really amazing history around the kinds of solutions that people have created to address issues of safety, ways that even in the Hill District, you had a development of its own emergency health system. It's got a lot in it, and this was written by a whole collective, input given on 2 different occasions in public gatherings. So I really hope folks take some time, go through that. I think you'll have a lot there. So without further ado, I want to just introduce the panelists so we can really get to hearing everyone we're going to hear from tonight. So first, Dustin Gibson works to end institutionalization and incarceration. He's worked with all of the Centers for Independent Living in Southwest Pennsylvania. He's the Access, Disability, and Language Justice Coordinator at People's Hub, a peer support trainer with Disability Link, a board member with Straight Ahead, and a founding member of Us Protecting Us, the Harriet Tubman Collective and Police in the Policing in Allegheny County Committee, which I want to note, that committee offered some really great work that we were able to build on for that reimagining public safety vision. So I hope folks can go and check out some of they have an amazing set of resources. Next, Faith McClendon is a senior at Robert Morris University with a major in criminal justice and a minor in cyber forensics. At RMU, she is currently the student ambassador for Multicultural Student Services, a mentor for incoming freshmen, and vice president of the Criminal Justice Society. Outside of school, Faith is a member of Black Lives Matter Washington County Coalfield Justice Grassroots Organization and co-founder and co-chairperson of the Young Black Panther Party Pittsburgh and Southwestern Pennsylvania chapter. Outside of working towards Black liberation, they enjoy their second passion, which is cooking. And pronouns are they and them, as well as she and her. Dolly Prabhu is a staff attorney, an Equal Justice Fellow, Equal Justice Works Fellow at the Abolitionist Law Center. She is a 2020 graduate of the University of Pittsburgh School of Law. Her fellowship focuses on challenging probation practice in Pennsylvania. She is the lead author of ALC's December 2020 report on apartheid policing in Pittsburgh, and ALC's February 2021 report on the Pennsylvania Office of the Victim Advocate. I definitely also wanted to hold up that report that was also really important to the vision, the reimagining public safety, the apartheid policing in Pittsburgh. A lot of great information there that I hope folks will go check out. And finally, Gio Mayer is a Philadelphia-based writer and organizer and educator who has taught at Vassar College, San Quentin State Prison, and the Venezuelan School of Planning in Caracas. He is a senior research fellow at the Global Center for Advanced Studies and has held visiting positions at the College of William & Mary, NYU's Hemispheric Institute, and the National Autonomous University of Mexico. He is the co-editor of the Duke University Press series Radical Americas and author of 6 books: We Created Chavez, Building the Commune, Decolonizing Dialectics, and A World Without Police, which I understand will be coming out shortly. So it's great to have all of you all. And first of all, how's everybody doing? Good, más o menos? Okay. Yeah. I thought, because this is all framed as understanding abolitionism, and just wondering if each of you might just share a bit about what abolition means to you, how you understand it, key elements that you feel like we should be, applying, talking about. And I'll start with you if you don't mind, Faith.
So abolition to me is actually solving the problems, because people think police and putting people in jail and doing other things really solves the issues. Oh, they're doing time, so that's what they deserve for committing a crime, but that's not proactive. Abolition is being proactive and preventative to the current state we're in, because to be honest, we could do a lot better. This world could be totally different with abolition, in my opinion. So just doing a lot better than where we currently are at, and like I said, being productive, being progressive, and preventing things from happening, because they don't need to happen. Things happen for a reason, and those things can not be like that. But I'll explain more later.
That's great. Dustin, would you kind of add on?
Yeah, this is Dustin. So I would take from far greater thinkers than myself and paraphrase Dr. Ruth Wilson Gilmore when she talks about abolition is defeating and exposing the relationship between the police and prison apparatus that makes the United States the top cop. So I view it as partly of that, and then I also she goes on to talk about changing the way we interact with each other and the planet. So in that frame, I'm viewing abolition as a means to survival, not only for the planet but for people as well. And I think abolition is something. Well, I know abolition is something that is happening at all times, and it has always happened. And I don't think without it we wouldn't get to this point. And without it in the future, I don't know if we'll have a future here.
Great, thank you. Dolly, would you share your thoughts?
Yeah, sure. And my definition of abolition also comes from others, probably a combination of what I've heard from other, as Dustin said, greater thinkers than myself. But, to me, my understanding of it now is striving towards a world without police and prisons and surveillance. And importantly, like getting to a place where not only do we not have those things, but we don't need those things, because we're addressing people's needs and preventing what our society now calls criminal behavior, which, I wouldn't even categorize the same way. But for behavior that can't be prevented, or for harm that can't be prevented, we're addressing it in a different way, in a more effective and a more meaningful way that will actually result in long-term change. Because right now, police and prisons and jails, despite what the media might say or mainstream rhetoric, they're not actually very good at keeping us safe. Their clearance rate for crimes is 2%. They only spend 4% of their time on violent crime. And then aside from them just being ineffective, they're also incredibly harmful to many of our communities, especially our Black communities or marginalized communities. So just kind of understanding that there is a better way to live, and it's worth the effort to try to get as close to that as we can.
That's great. And then finally to you, Gio.
Yeah, no, I think everyone has put it really incredibly. And, I think it's important to remember that we get the name abolition from first wave abolition, from the abolition of slavery. But despite the fact that I think abolition refers to the destruction of institutions, part of what, many contemporary abolitionists will insist on is that it's actually about creating alternatives, creating new institutions. And that one of the main historical shortcomings of the abolition of slavery is that these institutions and alternatives were not created. Instead, we got white supremacy, we got the police, and got capitalism. And that's what has been, the legacy of that partial abolition. So abolition and reconstruction always go together to create what others have just called, right? A world without police, without prisons, in a world in which, as Angela Davis puts it, these institutions are obsolete, right? It's not simply about trying to tear these institutions down, although we definitely want to do that, but it's about creating a new world in which those institutions are not required. And I think that while that seems really daunting and it sounds like a huge project, it certainly is a project for radical change, but I think it's also important to remember that abolition is all around us, right? We don't, for the most part, we don't call the cops on our family members, on our neighbors when we can avoid it. We look for different ways to solve, conflicts in communities. And that's, the kind of fabric that needs to be built up, right? And to build this different kind of world at the same time that we're struggling against these old institutions.
Yeah, I definitely appreciate the idea that I think all of you are saying that there's this need to build alternatives. And I wonder about, the most extreme example I think that I feel like people put to the test on abolition is, well, what to do with cops who kill, right? And you'll see that online sometimes that someone will kind of jump in the conversation and say, all you all who are calling for like the imprisonment of this cop don't understand something about abolitionism. And I just wonder if there's any of you who want to kind of jump in with a point of view on any side of that. And even, I guess, really, in terms of the idea that it's a process, like what does it mean today, right? Like what does when you have Derek Chauvin on trial, right? What does abolitionists say about how we're supposed to react and what we're supposed to suggest in that case? Well, I'll go to you, Justin. I'm going to come back to you then and ask you for your thoughts.
Okay, cool. This is Dustin. So I think as people that are organizing, that are activists, it's important for us to, as Angela Davis describes, is like continue to be consistent. And when people are murdered by the police and families are in grief, rightfully so, and they're calling for justice, I think it poses like and I don't think I know, I've been a part of it posing like a question for us to like really wrestle with. And I think what abolition invites us to do, it welcomes us to find a different way to support families. We know that we can't call upon the same system that does harm to us to actually provide us justice. And that's what we do when we ask for the arrest and the incarceration of killer cops. Another thing it does is legitimize the system or the effectiveness of what a prison does. So we're saying that we want police to be accountable, and that mechanism is to put them in prison. We're validating that is a way to hold people accountable. And we know that prisons, if anything, remove the possibility for accountability, whether it's police that have done harm or other community members. So a consistent way to show up under abolitionist framework to me is like develop new ways to support families, which has been done in Pittsburgh, right? People organize to bring food to families. People organize to provide financial support. People organize to like rent out spa days. So there's all these ways in which communities can show up. But that doesn't say that we just do nothing with the cop that has done something, right? Like we can push for things under a reparations framework to understand that we need this to not happen again. When we jail a killer cop, it does nothing to actually alter the system or change it. But if we're to remove them from ever being a police officer again, if we're to put them through a different process, it could look different. So I think the hard thing here is an attempt to just find like an easy solution to what we can do. And I think it'll be an individual basis every single time, as is with every harm that is committed. And one way that kind of helps me think about this is not using a framework of alternatives. Because again, that kind of legitimizes the police and the prisons as something that is giving a public good. So the alternative framework forces us to find like this other system that is going to be a catch-all for everything. But as we know, like in families and daily interactions, we have instances where harm is done or when people are upset, and we find different routes to actually rectify or reconcile those situations. And I think we have to use the same lens and take that approach when it comes to cops too.
That's great. Yeah. I'm hoping we have a little bit of an open conversation. So I'm just curious if anyone, if Dustin said anything that anyone kind of has a response to or wants to build on, or.
Yeah, I think Dustin laid out very well, in a very sharp way, what I think an abolitionist framework is for thinking of tasks in those moments, right? I think it's important, and I think it's an incredibly difficult question. I think it's always important to remember that abolitionism is a movement, right? And I think our starting point really always needs to be the streets, always needs to be what people are struggling with, and often it has to do with engaging with what people are demanding. And so I go back and forth a lot on this question. I don't think jails were made for cops. I think sometimes cops going to jail puts wind behind a movement that then allows us to grow the abolitionist demand, I think, even broader. I think it's a measure sometimes of the strength of those movements that cops are even put on trial at all. And I think that's been a key for, I think, grasping the Chauvin trial, but also going back, many, many years as well. And so I think when people are demanding, as a fundamental demand, that police impunity stop, that police be arrested for something that someone else would be arrested for, I think there's this complicated dance of needing to respect that demand and respect that impulse. At the same time that, that we're always trying to point beyond an individual, right? It's not an individual solution. There's no individual solution to this problem. It's a collective solution. It's a structural solution. And so insofar as that individual struggle can help to expand that abolitionist horizon, all the better.
That's great. Yeah. Yeah. Faith or Dolly, do you either have a thought about this issue? And you don't feel you mandated, but just curious.
Yeah, I have some thoughts. I mean, I agree with what has already been said by Gio and Dustin. And, I also agree that, the prison industrial complex isn't designed to deliver justice and never will. It's also not designed to convict killer cops, although it may sacrifice a few here and there. But the reality is that, it'll always primarily be a tool to oppress marginalized populations. That being said, it's like we're not obviously living in a society that's even close to abolition. So people are reacting with the resources they have, which is only sometimes cops in prisons, or that's all they know. So it's understandable. And that's part of the work of abolition is not only dismantling the prison industrial complex, but providing other resources and better, not to use the word alternatives, but better other avenues. That way, there is something that people that will react to gravitating towards, rather than what we're told is justice, which is not really true justice, and will not deliver us justice. That being said, I think this is obviously one of the more complicated questions and difficult questions, I think. And I think there's a lot of these kind of like discussions that happen among abolitionists, which is super important and needed. But I think it's always important to bring it back to, like, while we might disagree on how we're reacting right now, the end goal is still, we want a future where we're not even having this conversation. We don't have to decide how we're reacting to police killings or killer cops specifically. So, I mean, that's still the end goal, and we can all still practice abolition, even if, we have to move through some uncomfortable or difficult conversations or discussions.
Yeah. I just want to remind folks who are watching live that if you have a question, please drop it in the comments section under the live stream, and then we're going to get those questions in as well. Faith, you have a thought about this?
Yeah, I was just gonna say that I feel society just really thinks this system is broken and all that, but it's really not. It's designed how it was made to design. Like, oh yeah, he's in prison now, but that doesn't really mean anything, because that's like kind of hypocritical for what we're fighting for. So when we want true justice, because being in prison is not justice, a cop being in prison isn't justice. Making sure like they don't have, like, the union isn't supporting them financially, they don't get paid leave whenever they're under investigation, things like that.
Yeah.
Put in place so they actually do pay the price for it in some sort of way, because there's no reason for a killer cop to still be getting money, or even possibly rehired somewhere else, actually having consequences, real consequences that are going to last longer than however many years,
Mm-hmm.
And actually be like, effective whenever we come to this. And this, every area varies, but having proper consequences for their actions, that's very important, because, like I said, being in prison, I mean, yeah, a killer cop is in there, but there's how many Black people else in there, so finding something else more effective that holds people accountable who needs to be held accountable, and not just being helped reintegrate into society as well, and proper tools to be successful in society when it comes to like not having prisons, but people who are actually doing terrible things such as being a killer cop are held accountable.
All right. Yeah. Are there like strategies or steps that we should be advocating for today that you feel like could also show benefit today? Like, are there things that that in this process of abolition that they're like, yeah, there's some things that are happening that we are advocating for right now, and we think that it could benefit people's lives like now, and I just wonder, going to you, Dolly, if there are those kinds of those things that people are working on that kind of like typify what you could get involved in and be working on.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I don't think there's like a shortage of ways to get plugged in. I think there's a lot of ways to practice abolition, whether it's fighting to get police out of school, increasing access to necessary resources like housing, like healthcare, food, childcare, just decreasing the number of like police interactions with people, like getting them out of traffic enforcement, like things like that. I mean, there's a lot of avenues. And one way that I've heard a lot of other abolitionists describe like a good, I guess, starting place or a good way to conceptualize abolition is by like asking people, what makes them feel safe. And a lot of the times it's things like, a vehicle, accessible public transportation, childcare, stable housing, adequately resourced schools, not having armed cops in their kids' schools, things like that. And those are all like things that can be achieved. So it doesn't have to be like an overwhelming, how do we get to abolition? It sounds like a utopia. Like these are like each of these small pieces just move us closer to a better, more abolitionist society and a safer society. Because really this is about like public safety and keeping our communities safe at the end of the day.
Yeah. Yeah, curious if any other of you all have any thoughts about that, particularly in Pittsburgh, but I guess it obviously is an international issue, but are there elements you're like, yeah, we should be doing this?
I feel like one thing is not allowing the police budget to expand. I know people bring the attention to that, but I feel like we should be paying more attention to it. We should stay on it. Like, wow, it's how many millions or billions of dollars? People acknowledge it, but what are we going to do about it? It's a cycle of something happens, rage, and then nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people are stuck in that cycle. Honestly, I'm sick of the cycle. But yeah, it's just we have to actually be on it. If we gonna be about it, we have to be about it. If we really have a problem, we have to really stay on it. Yeah. So.
Yeah. You gonna say something, Dustin?
Yeah, this is Dustin. So again, this is like thinking about abolition as something that like lives beyond like prisons and police and military, and it happens in thousands of ways, right? So as Dolly mentioned, like healthcare and food justice work, and all of the other things that we need to actually just not survive but thrive, and also that are a part of our daily routines. Like all of that I view to be a part of how do you get engaged in abolitionist work. And another thing that is important to not forget is like supporting prisoners right now too is another material way to actually, change material conditions a lot of the times. And that could be as easy as a phone zap sometimes, calling into a prison to say that because it's 30 degrees outside, it's 20 degrees inside the cell, and the water in the toilet is frozen. So putting pressure on the DOC in that regard. Or what happened at the beginning of the pandemic, folks in Pittsburgh organized to provide phone chargers and cigarettes and cash cards to people coming out of the county jail, and gave them information on COVID, right? So like all of those are like practices like are of mutual aid that is important to know, disconnected from like a foundation or a nonprofit industrial complex. It's community showing up for each other because the failure of the state. So along with that is political education, is another huge way that it's happening right now. Last summer, along with Nia, who was at APA, organized like a Pittsburgh Without Police Fund and gave $1,200 to maybe like 15 young people who were practicing abolition. And some of them were doing farms in Homewood. Some of them are artists, digital artists. One was a 12-year-old poet, but the whole idea was to like expose like, hey, this is how we actually get beyond a world that has police and prisons, by practicing all of these other things, and education being like a cornerstone of that, because we as organizers, we have to mobilize people, and we have to educate our folks about prisons and police, because there's been so much propaganda to counter what we know to be actually true about what we need.
Yeah. I mean, when you hear the phrase, like the term abolition, I appreciate, Dustin, you're saying that it's actually much more than just simply the incarceration system, police. It's an entire way of life. And I guess I just wonder about the language of it, like I feel like we heard language of like revolution at one point, and that was the core language. And now when I hear even the expansion of abolition, I'm even wondering, is there a differentiation between that? Is that just another generation has come and this is the language of this generation? And because it's a term that does mean to get rid of, most of us understand of it to get rid of, does it cause a challenge with people having a sense of, well, people say the same thing about anti-racism, right? Like, what is it to be opposed to something? So I guess I just wonder, as you communicate this and as you try to build a movement, what's your thinking about the framing of it and its language, and any thoughts you have on that? Y'all are very.
Go ahead, Gio. Sorry.
No, Gio didn't say anything. It was you.
Yeah, go ahead, Dustin.
Okay, cool. So yeah, I mean, and Ruth Wilson Gilmore talks about abolition as presence rather than absence, and I can't 100% with certainty say how abolition, say, of slavery was defined, but I'm assuming that it was more so the destruction of something. But that's a part of, like, I think a lineage. Like, to understand abolition is a part of a Black radical tradition of people that have organized, right? Like, so it's not something that is new. It has evolved and it has grown, and a part of that growth is recognizing what happened during the abolition of slavery and what are some of the things that might have been missed, right? And that's an important period to think about Reconstruction, because there is like a huge effort supported by the state, and then the state enacting a repression, a violent repression against Black folks organizing during that period. And we can look at co-ops, we can look at electoral politics, all of those different ways. So we're in this generation up against a new force of surveillance in prisons and police that calls on us to act in a different manner, I think. And I should just briefly mention, like, the self-determination and the self-defense piece, which I absolutely see as a part of abolition, is one of the gaps that I think is missing. And that's kind of the questions that I think will animate the work for the rest of our lives. Because those are the questions that we routinely get as organizers about, well, what do we do about the violence that is enacted upon us from us, which is intrinsically tied to the state? So the political education piece is, connecting that to systemic failure or success, I guess. And then wrapping our minds around that idea that, like, it is a warlike condition that we're in. So it calls on us to build things in that regard. So I think, to answer your question, I think that is the understanding of what abolition is, a destruction, and a part of the work of abolition. The political education piece is understanding it is a presence of something else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'll leave space for anyone who want to jump in on that topic, or we'll go to something different.
Yeah, sure. I'll add something on, just as I think about the importance of, like, language and about framing things in terms of abolition and not using softer language to appeal to the mainstream or whatever. Because, one of the things that got me to abolition is realizing just how incredible the prison industrial complex is at adapting and reform, or adapting to reform and changing forms. From, obviously, it descended from slavery, and it's still around today. It's just as big as ever, and it's continually taking, the most well-meaning, nice-sounding reforms and twisting it into another form of surveillance and control and exploitation. And so realizing that, like, the only way to really prevent this is by taking an abolitionist approach. We want to destroy this. We don't want to change this. We don't want to negotiate it or swap it for something different, because we see how that goes. I think using that language is important, because we are trying to dismantle something. And I mean, that should be on the forefront, I think, of, like, messaging and things like that, because I think that's really the only way forward sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Completely agree. And, in terms of the question of revolution, I mean, I think abolition is revolutionary. I don't think we need to shy away from either of those. But also, I think it's good if abolition is a term that helps people who maybe don't think of themselves as yet revolutionaries to jump on board and to start organizing and to get drawn into something which is much bigger, which is anti-capitalist, which is anti-patriarchal, which is anti-white supremacist, all of those things. And again, early abolitionists were those people that said, you don't negotiate with white supremacy. You don't say, okay, well, slavery is bad, but what's the middle ground between slavery and abolition? They say you can't take something so evil and split the difference, right? You abolish things that are evil. When you find something that's evil, you abolish it, you destroy it. And I think that's what's powerful about the abolitionist language. At the same time, to get back to your previous question, abolition manifests as changes, right? As reforms, if we want to call them that. And so a lot of people are trying to walk this line and figure out, well, what are the good reforms and what are the bad reforms? I think it's absolutely true that the system reincorporates so many reforms. The many attempts to abolish the death penalty, for example, ended up reinforcing life without parole, aka death by incarceration, right? The logic and the rhetoric was recycled into the system. But in terms of what makes people's lives better, Mariam Kaba has got a great little list of reforms that people should support, right? Abolitionist reforms. And there's a bunch of items on it, specific proposals, but the long and the short of it is anything that gets police away from people, right? Anything that reduces the interaction of police with the community. And here defunding is a great example, not fake defunding, but a kind of real defunding that would take police out of the community and allow the community fabric to be reestablished, to have those alternatives be redeveloped at the same time that you're taking that money and doing much more creative and useful things with it.
Yeah, I'll just say one of the things that was in that reimagining public safety in Pittsburgh and Allegheny County, it mentions that in Pittsburgh there's 30 police for every, I believe it is 10,000, which is like not quite double, but definitely like close to it, compared to other similar sized cities where there's 19 police for every 10,000 people. And that may have even come from the ALC report. I'm not sure. But we have a question from the community watching, and this is from Joshua Williams, and asks, there was a Gallup poll in 2020 that found 15% of Americans and 22% of Black Americans supported abolition. Why do you feel that this number is so low when people strongly support police reform as a whole? What is preventing people from shifting from reform to abolition?
I feel like it's miseducation. Like most things in the world, when there's issues, is just miseducation. When people hear defund the police or abolish the police, they think, oh, just get rid of the police and everyone runs wild and crazy. That's not that. Or defunding, oh, well, we need the police. No, we don't. So, and if you look at history, they were slave catchers. And whenever the slaves were freed, that's when you start to see prisons. Because when you look at the black codes, one of the black codes was if you're over the age of 18 and you do not have a job, you were thrown in prison. So, and it's just like over time, it's like, all right, fighting against slavery, like freeing the slaves, and then it was civil rights, and now it's like abolishing the police, and it's always been abolition in some type of form, and that's what it is today, because incarcerated people, that's technically slavery. They don't really get paid anything, if at all, and a lot of it's, like I said, it's miseducation. And even in my own community, when I say abolish the police, they're like, what? I'm
Right.
like, then you got to explain to them, and not every person has access to those materials to learn more about that as well. And that's also part of the issue. And I feel like certain groups also, specifically some white people, they do not want to understand. They don't try to really understand because they're in their little white bubble pretty much of their world, and they don't see anything outside of that because everything's perfectly fine to them. But if you look at someone else's perspective, it's not like that. Everything doesn't work the same as it works for you. The system works for you. The system does not work for us. So understanding that. Sorry?
No. I was jumping before you were finished.
Okay. Yeah, I'm done now.
Well, I just think, building on what you said, Faith, I really appreciate you saying, when you say this in your community, people are like, what, and I just, wonder, do you hear folks say, well, who are we going to call if there's a violent crime? Like, and what do you say?
We call on each other. Who do we trust? We trust each other. We keep us safe.
Mm-hmm.
You hear a lot of us say that in the abolitionist movement, we keep us safe because it's true. We don't need cops. A lot of the crimes happen because a lot of needs aren't met. There's mental illnesses, other things too that happen with people, and that those things can be solved. And in that way, the crimes won't happen. I know my neighbor, she saw a picture in my room. It says Black trans lives matter, abolish the police. She's like, well, we need the police. This one person told that they were going to kill me. But as she described the incident, it sounded like a mental health issue instead of someone actually, in their right mind saying, I'm going to kill you. So really asking the question why these people commit crimes and what to do. That's a big part in my major. So we really have to dig deep besides like this incident. We need to figure out why it happened, who's doing it, and their background and everything like that. So that's how I respond to like abolishing the police when it comes to my own community.
Yeah. Well, there's one book I think is called Ghetto Side, and it kind of talks about like this policy of like allowing homicides in Black communities for like more than 100 years, and that I know in Pittsburgh that the rate of even arrest is like below 50%. The idea that people are being safe, right? That like even in these most violent incidences, it's not like it's actually producing safety and protection, and people know that. But I also wonder if you all might speak around the abolition, actually even maybe speaking about, because sometimes people say we'll solve it ourselves, but they handle it like we're gonna go handle this situation ourselves, and it can be then involved in like ongoing murder, right? Like ongoing situations, and that's where I feel like you'll see sometimes people post like, where is the Black Lives Matter movement on this case here of murder, of our own cases of murder inside the community, right? And just wondering if abolitionism is saying something about how we think about justice, even among ourselves. So even if we were going to call it on ourselves, is that asking for like a transformation of how we even think about justice, even if it is just ourselves? Do we have to change how we even think about justice, even among us?
I think absolutely, and I think to get to these kind of debates, especially, we know the contradictions within communities around these questions. We know the tensions, but these contradictions grow out of the fact that this is a world built around policing, right? This is a world in which everyone is constantly told the police are the only alternative. They're the only ones you can call, in which the police are meant to solve mental health crises, everyday health crises, in which, anytime you call 911 for something unrelated, the police show up. And so I think honestly, 19 to 22%, those are good numbers. I think we're doing pretty good. And the question is, how do we push that further? And how do we, push these kind of debates further within the community? And there, I think one thing that needs to be headed off right at the beginning is it's not that we're saying that, the police are providing some low level of safety and we're going to do better, right? We can do better. I mean, on the one hand, the second part is true, but we need to be very clear about the fact that the police do not provide safety. They do not, we're talking statistically, we're talking numerically, they do not make society safer. They do not solve crimes. Even if you thought solving crimes meant arresting people and throwing them in jail, that's 1% of all so-called violent crimes. We're not talking about a situation in which the police do remotely what they even claim to do. They don't. And so we're actually put in a situation where we have to figure it out. And no one is keeping society safe. And so I think the point that you raise is very good, which is this, and it's a right-wing talking point as well, which is to say, well, look at Chicago, look at this violence, why don't you care about that? When you don't realize that the violence that the police inflict upon the community and the violence in poor communities of color come from the same cause, right? Which is capitalism and white supremacy and the systematic looting of communities of color and poor communities. And so it's not that these are opposites, they're actually just the same thing. The way you're proving the point, for us. Some people, you're talking about abolition, they'll say, well, someone the other day said, well, how did that work out for Chicago? And it's like, Chicago was one of the most over-policed cities in the country, and look how it's going, right? And so that tells you very clearly that it's not the police that are going to solve these problems. It's the community organizations in Chicago. It's organizations like MASK. It's Mothers Against Senseless Killing and others that are on the ground intervening in communities and building that community fabric.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. You coming forward, Dustin, to say something?
Yeah, so this is Dustin. Thinking about, like, I think I first heard this from Vanessa German when she talked about, this is to Dolly's point about the language. She said that the police weren't the first responders, the people that responded first. And she was speaking specifically about Homewood, were people in the community. So I think about that and apply it to like an understanding of like the utility of police and what we've been told about the police. So the question that was in the chat was like, why is the number so low? Like, I think in part because there's been a massive effort of propaganda to uphold like what and build really the police and prison apparatus. So we can't discredit that. Like, ever since I've been young, there's been a cop show on TV every single night. showing them in like a certain type of light. And we know it goes further than that. We know it's like DOJ contracts with the NFL to have patriotism or symbols of patriotism, and an entire military month dedicated during the end. So it's like that's what we're up against. Thinking about just like the reason that there's not a lot of support. The thing I gain hope from is there's never been like a huge amount of people to support mass movements. It's always a critical mass that actually gets shit going. And another part of the reason I think it's so low is like there's real shit that happens in communities that like people are actually afraid of, and it's happened to people. And that's like the question that animates the work. But I think for us is like what we're pushing for is, do we want to invest in the police to do that? Because we have for 100 years and we know they haven't, and they've been a source of a lot of the violence that happens. Or do we want to invest in a different way, which will be messy and is already messy? And that question of like, what do we do with people that have committed crimes that we view to be violent? Like those people are living next door. Those people are on the street. Like those people are presidents of like the president of the U.S. at any given time is a warmonger, right? Murdering hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Black and brown people across the world. So like those type of questions, I think a lot of the times they're in bad faith as right-wing talking points, or they're coming from a place of like actual fear because we don't know what we're going to do. And I don't have like a easy answer for that fear. I too live in that fear. So like that's a part of why we want to be abolitionists.
Absolutely.
To add on to that, I think, I mean, I agree with everything everyone's been saying. And, you know, people do act like it's such a huge risk to even take away like a single resource from cops. And again, I mean, that is because of just like how good America is at propaganda. And, you know, it requires so much unlearning to even consider some of these ideas sometimes. But then when you look at like actual numbers of like police budgets and like how they've been swelling over time related to actual, you know, so-called crime, you see that there's like no correlation despite, you know, we haven't gotten any safer despite all this extra money and resources that we've been pouring into police budgets over the past like decade. And so there really isn't a risk to, you know, like if we've seen no corresponding increase in safety, why would we believe that taking that money away from the police would make us less safe? You know, it already doesn't make any sense. And again, you know, the statistics are that police spend like 4% of their time on violent crime. And who knows what that even means? You know, I wouldn't even bet that that's doing a whole lot of, you know, prevention or, you know, addressing things in a positive way. So, I mean, it, you know, just logically, aside from people's lived experience, which I think, you know, many of us can agree that, you know, cops have never made a lot of us feel safer or like solved any problems. They're usually escalators of violence. But, you know, additionally, just looking at like the numbers and the resources we're putting in, like defunding should not be like a scary step or like intimidating in any way in regards to public safety.
Can you share, I don't know if it's at the hand, Dolly, any of what you found in apartheid policing, just in terms of just some of the amount of money spent on policing in Pittsburgh and Allegheny County and things that some of us might not even know about how much even we're expending on this?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, the number that's like off the top of my head is that the police budget has increased the Pittsburgh police budget has increased almost 60% in the past few years, I think like 5 years. And of course, you know, there's nothing to show for that. So okay. I think, yeah.
Yeah, that's a good one.
That speaks for itself.
Yeah.
And also, the whole graduating class, police academy in Pittsburgh was all white, by the way. So, yeah. So, Peduto and whatever, you know, whoever's gonna be mayor next, you know, but even Peduto saying like, oh, he cares about Black lives, and like the whole meeting with him whenever we were outside his house last year, he tried to sit down and talk, but he went back in his house and I say he does support us, but you don't, because why is, as Dolly said, why is the spending up? Why is there no quote unquote diversity in the graduating police academy? It doesn't add up. It doesn't add up. So
yeah. You know, I appreciate earlier it was said, this is going on now, right? So this is not some time in the future. This is something that we're doing right now. We're working on it. And, and I'm just wondering what you would share about the ways in which people are addressing issues of harm, right? And I mean, like, yeah, here's some ways that we're thinking about. Here's some things that people can do to begin to we continue to expand relearning this idea of how we address harm. Because I think of even how we, in my own life, how I might have it with a conflict, right? Like, it's like we have to think about things much differently because that's how we've learned. We've learned, through cop shows, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. So any thoughts you have about like things that are going on, things that you feel like, hey, these are in our community already. And these are examples of what might be called transformative justice. But these ideas are not foreign to us, and we could continue to expand on them further.
I mean, I think these alternatives go all the way, from the level of the block you live on up to the level of engaging with the state and the government in ways that attempt to be transformative. By that, I mean, diversion programs to keep, people out of prison, to keep people away from the criminal justice system. That's all incredibly important. Engaging, with the state, pressuring the state. Again, we're talking about, on the one hand, fighting against this system at the same time that we're building an alternative. Fighting against means a lot of things. It means attempting to break and destroy police unions, because these are the sort of fascist spearhead of police power in this country. It means attempting to transform and get rid of those laws that give police special rights, the so-called Law Enforcement Bill of Rights, and these kinds of state level laws. It means attempting to engage in organizing against local contract negotiations with fraternal orders of police in different cities. And this is a very complex thing. There's different laws to protect the police that also need to be confronted. But when we get right down to the local level, there's organizations everywhere doing this work and doing it, I think, in different ways. Again, there's 911 diversion away from the police, through organizations like Cahoots and other networks that, attempt to send crisis intervention teams instead of the police. Cahoots, if I'm correct, was formed in Eugene, and immediately the number of police killings dropped to essentially zero. And most of the calls that went to 911 went to this crisis team instead. You've got, but all the way at the local level, we're talking about building with neighbors, building a text thread with your neighbors and a text group where people can get in touch with each other. That could be when they see the police, to keep an eye on what they're doing and sort of cop watch them and make sure they're not, misbehaving and that they leave, peacefully. But also when something's going on in the neighborhood, when there's a conflict, right? Because that's someone's child, that's someone's nephew, son, daughter, who's both being afflicted possibly, but also the perpetrator, right? And so how is it that you engage with these questions without bringing the police in, without inviting them in? And I think there are organizations everywhere doing that. And it's not even a question necessarily of organizations so much as it's a question of people building with each other, building with neighbors. As Dustin, I think, hinted at earlier, these organizations are much, much better when they stay away from the official kind of nonprofit, complex that tends to suck them in and away from their origins, and they become kind of less radical and less abolitionist, although you see that in the history of a lot of organizations. But these kind of groups are everywhere. If we're talking about the origins of, for example, rape crisis centers as places where women could seek refuge in communities, refuge from the police a lot of times, right? Trying to stay away from the police who don't make them safer either. But there are just so many organizations, and I think that's part of what people don't understand is that when it comes to crisis intervention, there are so many alternatives. It's a question of boosting those alternatives, of getting them, getting people diverted away from 911 and to these alternatives instead.
I also think that like our current prison industrial complex, the only thing it has to offer is punishment. So instead of focusing on how we deal with the person who's doing the harm, I think a great alternative that is already being employed all the time is communities figuring out how they're going to support the person who actually was harmed and listening to what they need and the support and resources that they need. Because a lot of times, the media likes to paint things in black and white of criminal and victim and person who's doing the harm and person who's being harmed, but it's a lot more nuanced than that. a lot of it's like interpersonal among families, within like relationships where there might be, you know, some sort of financial dependence, and, you know, it's a lot more complex, which is why like a lot of crimes, you know, like, you know, I think sexual assault is like a great example of like something that's very underreported, because the prison industrial complex cannot provide the support that's required for people who are harmed. And so just shifting that focus to what does this person actually need in this moment? Do they want a conversation with this person? Do they want a safe place to go? Do they want to just be heard, to an apology? Do they need childcare? Do they need time off work? Do they need therapy? Do they need meds? You know, like none of that is being addressed by the prison industrial complex. It's just incarceration. And that a lot of the times can make the life of the person who's harmed like a lot worse. And, you know, they might not want to go to trial or anything like that and publicly relive trauma, or be embarrassed by their community. So the system we have doesn't like work in a lot of cases, and that's why people don't seek it for help. So I think an alternative that is already happening a lot is focusing on the needs of the person who has been harmed and supporting them.
Okay, yeah. So you mentioned this, Gio, about reform and then abolition, and then what's the relationship, and I've heard some people talk about like a non-reformist reform, a reform that isn't really a reform, that's actually a step towards abolition, maybe you would say, or revolution, and then a reform that's actually maintaining this current system. And I've seen you tweet a little bit about this, Dustin, talking about like you were critiquing some of the suggestions coming from the city on like, here's what this police reform is. And you're like, I actually was looking at you writing in 2018 about, I think it's something that came really from the mayor-elect, you know, or he's not quite yet that, but, you know, Representative Gainey, and you're saying like these elements of this are actually really funding the police. And I just wonder if anybody might want to say like, hey, if you want to know what a reform that is actually moving towards abolition look like, it has these elements or a few of these elements. And if you want to know what a reform looks like that's actually reinstituting the state, strengthening it, it has these elements. How do we differentiate?
Well, this is Dustin. I'll just hop in quickly. I could say the article that you referenced, Justin, was I think it was from 2018. Ed Gainey said something to the mayor-elect, said something, well, I guess basically the mayor-elect said something to the effect of like, we're not here to point fingers at anybody, we're here to save lives, and referred to what the Democratic Party put forth, led by him, was as a police stimulus package, because it talked about training. And I think this is an important thing for organizers to like really push back on. Like even right now, as a part of his priorities on public safety, he has disinvesting and demilitarizing the police and investing in de-escalation training and community policing. So the political education part is important. I mean, in Pittsburgh, like specifically speaking about the Hill, like what happens after rebellions or riots is a push for community police in the 60s and 70s. And it gets us to a point where the former mayor now, Peduto, can increase the budget 40% over a 5-year period. And that idea that we're still investing in police in a different form of policing is what a reform is. It is uplifting the system. And for a non-reformist reform, and maybe I'll pass to Dolly, I don't want to put you on the spot, but ALC has like a bunch of examples of what it looks like to reform a system, to change the material conditions for people that are inside prisons and not increase the capacity or expand the system itself. I'm thinking about some of the work around solitary, even the latest, what APA pushed for, the bill at the county jail, like to get people out of solitary. I view that as a non-reformist reform because it is not expanding the system whatsoever, but it's changing the conditions for folks, which is important. Like these conversations around abolition, like really have to always involve people that are on the inside currently. And that's a struggle for folks on the outside, because a lot of the things that we would in theory, like just say we're not going to do because it looks like a reform, like actually needs to happen on the inside. And Dolly and the work of ALC is like a good example of what it looks like to be in struggle with people.
Yeah, I can jump in now, and also to kind of, I guess, like revisit like your earlier question, Dustin, in terms of like, is there an easy way to tell when you're looking at something, if it's abolitionist or reformist or whatever? And I think it's actually pretty easy. I think once you have like it's if this requires giving more money and resources to police or prisons or jails, it's a reformist reform, no matter how good it sounds. It's not going to help, and it has. And I mean, we have history to show us that. It's not just an opinion. It's not the first. All of the kind of reforms that have been offered in recent years, or none of them are new. We've heard them like over and over and over for decades. But that's part of like the importance of kind of approaching things from like an abolitionist lens. So like for like things in that I personally am working on, like thinking about like probation and cash bail, like these are things that were created as reforms, but now they're some of the major drivers of mass incarceration. So when we're trying to think about like pretrial freedom and how do we advance pretrial freedom, it's easy to say like, okay, we want to end cash bail, we want to, end probation, all this stuff. But then the prison industrial complex always wants to negotiate and say like, okay, sure, you're gaining momentum. We'll get rid of this, but we're going to replace it with, a pretrial risk assessment or ankle monitors, that kind of thing. And that might sound good initially, because it sounds like, and I mean, that's part of why it's so hard, because the prison industrial complex has such, it's so unfair to negotiate because they have such control over people's lives and loved ones. And it does sound, it sounds like good to be like, okay, instead of incarceration, this person will be out. But the reality is that's increasing the power of the prison industrial complex, and something that ironically is an alternative to incarceration does not mean it is necessarily going to decrease incarceration. And that's something we've seen like over and over. And even with e-carceration, a lot of the times when I'm court watching, ALC has a court watch program, a lot of the people who are in jail are in there because they were being monitored via an ankle bracelet. And because of that extra surveillance, they were caught doing something they weren't supposed to do, like stepping out of their house, like that kind of thing. So just because it's presented as an alternative to incarceration, it does not mean it's going to reduce incarceration. So I think it is important to ask, is this giving more or less resources to police, to prisons, when we're thinking about like reforms or, potential changes?
Yeah, and I think I would just add very quickly, I mean, you already said this, Dolly, I want to really put a point on it, right? Which is that it's also a question of, is it giving more power to the police? Is it giving more power to prisons? And so there are a lot of reforms that need to be undertaken because they weaken the organizing power of the police. And solitary, I think, is a really great example, because solitary is about not just punishment. Solitary is about political control. Solitary is used to silence people. It's used to break up political movements historically. And so one of the elements that make undermining solitary such a powerful reform, if you even want to call it that, is that it allows for, a reestablishment of that political power of those inside, to be in community, to be in struggle together. And I think it makes a huge material difference. Same thing when we're attacking the police, we're attacking the power of the police, right? Again, it's not enough to just build alternatives. It's not enough just to, to make those changes around the edges without getting right to the heart of weakening these systems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I saw you with a piece of paper, Faith. Were you going to say something with that? Can't hear you. Can't hear you. You're muted. Hey, Faith, you're muted. Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry. But yeah, just like some like statistics and stuff I got from like textbooks and stuff. But yeah, pretty much like Dolly said, if you're giving money to the police and like prison, still that's not abolition. That's just a reform. And I guess people try to make change in the meantime, but it really doesn't change, because like they said, like they always replace it with something else. And not allowing police budgets to expand, reducing power of police unions, fighting for budget cuts, advocating for the Bill of Rights for law enforcement, like I said earlier. Making sure we remove like racists from office, and making sure that they don't take any funds from unions either, too. And invest in resources for the communities, neighborhood councils, things like that. So yeah.
You know, were you about to say something, Dustin?
Yeah, there's a couple, and I'll drop these in the chat from Dean Spade. He talks about, like, does it provide material relief? Like, that's one question to think about. Does it leave out a marginalized group? Does it legitimize or expand the system? And like one example in Pennsylvania was when a lot of people that are in prison get transferred to psych units, and we don't have enough psych units for those people to get transferred. So as a part of a monitoring agreement, they built 100 more psych unit beds in the prison. And that was like a clear example of what it looks like to expand it. But also, like, if they didn't build it, they would have transferred them to a psych institution, which is also another form of incarceration. So the simple solution to me is like, let 100 people go. But that's like legitimizing that as something that is purportedly providing care, which it's not, and it's saying that the prison could actually do that, which, I mean, it can't. So I think how we think about it, even if it doesn't give more money to them, like Gio said, the power part of it is really important, and like the building a narrative around like what prisons and police actually do. That's something that we should like really challenge with the reforms.
Yeah. I just want to definitely, again, invite people to leave comments as well as questions, just to join the conversation. Also want to leave space for you all. If you have questions for each other, feel free just to jump in, and based upon, if you're curious about anything any of you all have said, to kind of add that. So I'm gonna leave a moment for that and to see if there's anything that you've heard, you're kind of like, I'm kind of curious about this, about something you said earlier.
I mean, I guess since, you know, I'm here in Philadelphia, a lot of you are organizing in Pittsburgh. I'd be curious to hear what you all see on the ground as, you know, the potentialities of abolitionist work, the barriers that you all are coming up against. I know that a lot of great strides have been made. I know that ALC has done a lot of amazing work, as well as have the organizations that y'all are part of. So, I mean, as an outsider, I'd just love to hear some of that.
I guess I'll just jump in. You know, I don't have a basis for comparison outside of Pittsburgh. I'll just say that. So it's hard to compare, but I know that you know, from my experience, the Allegheny County Jail is just absolutely, you know, like, I mean, jails generally are awful places, but you know, when just looking at like the numbers of like in terms of like use of force and stuff like that, it seems like an outlier. And, you know, I've also noticed, and again, I don't have like a comparative, like a basis for comparison, but that like probation is like a huge, you know, a lot of people are in jail on probation detainers, and that's like very glossed over in the discussion of like pretrial incarceration. But that's been my personal experience. I don't know if others, you know, have other things they want to add to that.
Oh yeah, I'm not sure if certain people have heard of like Jailbreak, but it's a group of like prison and jail abolitionists here in Pittsburgh. And one thing that we do is we give supplies to people in ACJ and people recently out of ACJ, like money for commissary, bus passes when they get out to go back to wherever they may need to go. And also we do like sound demos sometimes, and that's pretty much what we just show outside the jail, make a bunch of noise so they know that we have solidarity with them. And we'll get like song requests from them because we have connection with some of them inside. And that's what we did for New Year's. That's how I spent mine outside the ACJ, making noise for them. And also when it comes to policing, the UCR, which is the Uniform Crime Report, it says that violent crime makes up less than 2.5%. And from like criminal justice standpoint, it's kind of broad term. There's like aggravated assault, which is usually like homicide, rape, robbery, and then there's simple assault, which is when there's like few to no injuries really, and it's just very not productive in the way that they handle things. And at least 80% of people in ACJ are in there because they don't have the money to get out of there. So that whole cash bail thing, that's also an issue here, and we continue to fight for that, and also APA does too, I know. So just trying to make strides and also do mutual aid for those who are out of prison and jail, and we also like stay in communication with them when they're out to make sure they're doing all right, because at least 60% of them end up reoffending. So and that, you can't say prison and jails are effective whenever they keep going back. That's very much the opposite. So making sure that we do what we can as people out building momentum and platform and power, as mentioned before, so like we can actually get somewhere and get this abolition moving. So yeah, that's just what I am involved with here, doing that.
Wasn't sure you're going to add on to that, Dustin, or?
Yeah, this is Dustin. I don't think the comparisons between Philly and Pittsburgh are necessarily helpful, just because Pittsburgh, I think we deal with a different type of topography, infrastructure, lack of infrastructure that makes it difficult to connect the bridges, the water, and what has happened is like a lot of Black folks have been pushed out the city. So although we contend with the Pittsburgh police and that gets the majority of the attention, Black people live in the county and other folks live in the county where there's 130 different police departments like around that. So I think one of the issues is like really being able to coalesce around like some shared vision. And a part of what makes Pittsburgh difficult, or what I've experienced, is like the de-radicalization of movements based on like the proximity to local government, the proximity to folks in power. And it has been like very easy, well, not easy, I guess, but they have been able to infiltrate movements and de-radicalize it in a way that I don't think has happened as much in Philly. So I would say in Pittsburgh, the prisoner solidarity work has really been more fruitful than the police abolition work. And that separation, I think, is very intentional. But when we think about like abolishing the police, like you can't do that without abolishing the prisons and jails. And there's been a concerted effort to repress folks that have done organizing around the jail. So I guess like one of the things I would be interested in is to see like, Gio, from your perspective, like what is the DA's race and then the election, what has that done to shift things? Because one of the things that happens every time after somebody's murdered by police, or when there's attention on people that are murdered by police in the county here, is a focus on that DA position, because people are looking for accountability by the arresting of the officer. But yeah, that's something that, I mean, as abolitionists, like we push back against, but Philly has a purportedly progressive DA. So I'd just be interested to see what you think.
Yeah, absolutely. I think on the one hand, that's part of the different terrain here. On the other hand, that the election of Krasner is the result of the different terrain in a lot of ways as well. And I say that to say that, I mean, he was elected because of movements, right? He was elected because of the growing movements around questions of Black Lives Matter, large demonstrations of solidarity with Ferguson and Baltimore, many struggles that were going on around the police murder of Brandon Tate Brown over the number of years. And it led to this crystallization that pushed Larry Krasner into power. Now, I think the effect of that has been really complex. In some ways and through some aspects, you look at it and you're like, we're infinitely in a better position, having a progressive DA, but the contradictions don't go away, right? And so one of the things that I think really colors what we're talking about today is still the fallout from the George Floyd rebellions, which were, which in Philadelphia, I think were really, really incredible, massive. amount of power shown in the streets. Also, followed by mass repression, by the occupation of West Philly, by military style, weaponry. And that's all a result of an attack on the communities in struggle. But as a result of that, for example, what the district attorney's office wanted to do was divide the rioters from the looters and say, well, I think we'll divert, or we'll drop the charges eventually on the protesters, right? Those who are out there for political reasons, and the looters, we're going to throw the book at them. And this is, where that line is drawn in terms of, what the DA's office is going to be willing to bend on is really something that's, I think, determined by the power of the movements. But that line is always going to be drawn by that office. And so I think, that's one of the things that we're, dealing with today, is that tension and that contradiction. But, again, in a very different terrain in which historical movements are pretty powerful, in which abolition, it's been one of the cities, I think, that because of the history of sort of Mumia and the struggles around Russell Schultz and others, and that the presence of organizations like ALC, and, has allowed for the abolitionist, vision to be very present in Philadelphia. But these are the tensions that everyone's going through. And I think we should understand it as a fight back against movements nationwide. You've got, in San Francisco, Cesar Boudin, it's also being attacked by the right as a progressive DA, because, we're in the era of the fight back from the right? And it's going to be this so-called crime wave. And I say so-called, it's very real in Philadelphia, right? If we're talking about violent, homicide. The numbers are massive. They have nothing to do with police defunding, and they have everything to do with poverty and COVID, right? And so part of what we need to do moving forward is to fight this narrative that says, oh, we can't defund the police because of this panic that's being stoked around, violent crime. And to say, you know what, if violent crime is going up in your city, we know the police won't stop that. Let's look, toward alternatives that might actually be able to deal with those questions.
And I also wanted to add, here in Pittsburgh, recently, an inmate at ACJ passed away. His name was Martin Bukic. Hopefully I'm pronouncing it correctly. He died in his cell, and it took a while for the jail to speak out about it. So, holding people accountable, I know, we want to abolish prisons, but, when it comes to things like that, it needs to be held accountable. And also, people think a lot of this stuff's political, but for me, this is like a human rights thing. They shouldn't be given food that you wouldn't even want to give to your dog. And the suicide rate at ACJ shouldn't be the highest in the country. Things like that. That's unacceptable. And I feel one thing here in Pittsburgh is more attention needs to be drawn to these issues. I don't feel like enough people have their eyes or paying attention to things like this, because it doesn't happen to them. They don't see it, they don't hear about it. But we really need to start pushing for people to it be in their face. They cannot deny this, because people can deny things because they don't know about it. They aren't educated about it. But if they know about it, then there's no excuse. You pick your side. You make it very clear who's with us and who's against us. I mean, that necessarily in a bad way, but we have to let people know what is going on, because there's really no excuse for that. So we really need to get people educated and put things in their face when it comes to it. I personally feel in my experiences is not enough people know what is going on here, because it's not everybody knows about Pittsburgh. I don't live in Pittsburgh. I live in Washington County, and people don't know that area. And some people, they don't even know what Pittsburgh is. So just because we're up north in Pennsylvania, Southwest PA, things happen here. Trust me. So, yeah.
You're muted, Justin.
Wow. Okay. Thank you. Just saying, I appreciate that, Faith. One of the things that's in the chat is from Lorenzo Rulli. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name right. If anyone knows how to pronounce it correctly, and I'm not, please correct me.
That's right.
Okay. And so he's talking to a Rebecca David in the chat and says, the problem is the police themselves. Police don't have the training and any capacity to deal with mental health crisis, and drug-induced states are a mental health crisis. I know personally the police have zero training to deal with mental health crisis, as I was charged for hitting a cop during an episode that I don't remember. Pittsburgh currently criminalizes mental health illness. And I was just curious if you all might speak to some of the things, and even your thoughts about the strengths, the weaknesses, things that you think regarding non-reformist reform. You mentioned earlier geo cahoots, and wondered if you might even just share that model with folks who might not know what it is, and maybe you all might talk about that a little bit as an example, and probably something that's still in development and still being worked on, but that I'm just curious, for those of us who aren't even familiar with some things like that. That's really for anyone, really.
Yeah, I'll just quickly, say that, Cahoots. So Cahoots, for example, is a model that diverts 911 calls to crisis teams, right, including a mental health expert or trained person who can de-escalate situations. Police are not trained to deal with these questions, right? Police are, as many people have described them, violence workers. They bring one tool to any situation, which is violence, or the threat of violence. And when you look at it that way, it's not surprising that they don't resolve mental health crises, for example. The rates of violence against people suffering mental health crises are astonishing. Something like 16 times the normal rate of, the likelihood that you'd be subject to police violence or killing if you're in the midst of a mental health crisis. It's one of the many communities that the police don't protect, that they actually harm, far more often. And so, the Cahoots model is one of sending these teams instead. And again, as I said, on a tiny budget, on a budget that is, minuscule compared to the police budget of the city, they have managed to deal with almost all of these situations in entirely peaceful ways, because they don't require violence for the most part. They don't require incarceration, imprisonment. They don't require people to be torn away from their families. I think we do need to be slightly careful in the sense that we don't ever want to be in a situation where it sounds like what we're saying is the police need more training. Because this is one of the tricks that is used to funnel more money into the police, right? To say they need more training, they need better training. Derek Chauvin was trained, highly trained, and he was training others. The police officer that killed Rayshard Brooks outside of a Wendy's in Atlanta had engaged in thousands of hours of training, use of force, de-escalation, cultural sensitivity. Training is not you can't train away the problem of the police. And so I think it's true that police, are not trained to deal with mental health crises, but that's because they're police officers.
Great, thank you, Gio.
And I think to kind of add on to that, I think a lot of the times, like prison industrial complex will almost pretend that it's providing help and care for people who do have mental health needs, substance use needs, but that's not true at all. To call that care would be a gross overstatement. And, just being incarcerated itself for anyone, that's a highly traumatic event, and especially for people who do have more intense needs, require more mental health care, meds. That's a situation where that's just aggravating people's situation. And that's why I think most of the people in the jail have either a mental health, and when I say the jail, I should specify Allegheny County Jail, have either a mental health issue or a substance use issue, and most have both. And that's not unique to Allegheny County Jail. I just happen to know those stats. But meanwhile, only 5% of the jail is actually serving a sentence. So these are all people who don't need to be incarcerated, who are ending up in jail, who are being harmed while they're in jail. And then, but we still hear, oh, they're receiving treatment, they're receiving care. But when you look at what that actually is, it's not treatment, it's not care, it's just incarceration, it's just punishment. So I think just making sure it's a true diversion rather than what the prison industrial complex might call a diversion, which often isn't. It's often coercive, or care shouldn't be coercive. If you're forcing someone to go somewhere, that's not treatment. That's still a form of incarceration. So I think that's also important.
Yeah.
This is Dustin. I think that this is one of the areas where Miriam Kappa talks about versions of soft policing, and thinking about the tentacles of the state. And when we speak about disability broadly, this is one of the areas where it really illuminates how society at large, police included, are disposing of people based on like perceived deviance or disability. And there's a long history of, you know, the United States doing this with asylums, institutions, and oftentimes an alternative to or diversionary programs are offering mental health systems as a way to like decrease or decarcerate, when in fact like they're also incarcerating people, right? Any place that people can't get a burrito at 3 a.m. If they want to is a place where you're not free. That's kind of like the test that, or the litmus test that we use to determine if something is an institution or not. Before they were traditional, they were these large structures. They were, you know, in rural Pennsylvania, and now they're, you know, right in communities. If you go inside, plexiglass, locks on the doors, 24/7 surveillance. The addiction recovery spots, like over 50% of the referrals come from the courts. So to think about all of the ways that the state has a monopoly on this sort of violence, and how even under the guise of care, they are still incarcerating people, is like super important for this. And another thing is like, I struggle with the questions around, you know, what do we do when these types of harms are committed or when people are in a mental health crisis? Because we are using like the logic and the definitions of crisis that the state uses. And the state uses this definition of crisis, which it creates in order to create like a false need for police in the same way they do with crime. What we know to be true is the majority of people killed by police are folks that are disabled, a range of disabilities. So psychiatric disabilities included, along with deafness, along with diabetes. We get some of our case law from people that are in epileptic shock based on like having diabetes, like some Graham and Connor, like some of our most foundational laws around policing. So to think about the police as the exacerbators of disability, the creators of it to justify their use of force, and people that cause disability as well, is through inflicting violence, is important to think about. I spent a lot of time thinking about like Bruce Kelly Jr., who was murdered in Wilkinsburg. He's somebody that had schizophrenia, diagnosed disabilities, but on the day that he was murdered, he had officers with guns following him through a neighborhood as he walked for 20 minutes. Like that is something that is a reasonable fear, like a reaction to that. A dog being sicked on you is to kill the dog, right? Or defend yourself. But him having schizophrenia was used as a justification. And even in the way we have discourse about it, it still is like, well, what do we do differently with Bruce or people like Bruce? And the answer is like, we just don't have police intervention, because the police are creating and causing the crisis most of the time. So I think if we shift the question to something different, like what do we need when people are actually in a crisis, and defining a new version of what crisis is, then we get to a point where we're not even considering police anymore. And I'm going to pause because the interpreter switched, and it's a good time to stop.
Okay.
I actually wanted to add one more thing, if I'm not interrupting anyone, just while we're still on the topic. A lot of people who are in jail, I think I did mention the vast majority are obviously not serving a sentence. A lot of them are just waiting for beds. Like they're waiting for beds and care facilities, and the judges are refusing to just let them out. That's not an option. It's, well, we need to help them. Therefore, they're going to wait in jail for as long as we can put them in this pseudo prison where they're also not allowed to leave. And if they do leave or do something wrong, or they have like, you find some weed in the trash can or a Coors Light can, they're coming right back to jail. So that's, you know, to call that care and treatment, that's not what that is. And it's just another jail. And they're also, I mean, that's not freedom. Obviously, that's not even close to freedom. So just wanted to put that out there as well.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, just quickly, because this is
take your time
out of the conversation, which is that, and I just want to again be clear about things that we've been talking about, is that the point is not, this has come up with a lot of the abolitionist talk, is like defund the police and fund mental health. It's like, well, it depends on what you mean. Fund social services, it depends on what you mean. Fund schools, it depends on what you mean, because all of those institutions can be carceral police type institutions, right? And many of them are, right? And so, you know, a lot of the important calls, and Dorothy Roberts has been emphasizing the idea of like, listen, we need to abolish many forms of so-called social, social welfare, right? And particularly things like child protective services, right? Which is a carceral institution, a deeply racist institution. And so we just also, it's to say we need to be careful. It's not about funding mental health professionals, because a lot of times those professionals are the problem, right? It's about a specifically abolitionist mode of intervening to help people work through the crises in a way that centers them, right, and centers their needs in the process.
Yeah. You know, one question, I'm not sure if it's a little, anyway, you know, is, we were on this last call, Dustin, when we did the town hall in Dali. I think you were there as well, right? And you'll hear like a reference to the state, right? I'm not sure we all necessarily maybe have the same definition of what the state means, I wonder just even, you know, as like, I recognize it in some ways, like from, let's say, like a Leninist, Marxist, communist kind of idea. And I wonder how abolitionism thinks about this, right? Is the idea with abolition in the big sense is like eradicate the state, right? And then we live in like a much decentralized world. And is that the underlying kind of thinking that that is there versus take control of the state? And I've seen even sometimes the Abolitionist Law Center say like, that's the issue. We have to take control of it. And you know, as we're starting to wind down, this is a question really that I'm wondering as I'm listening to you, and I'm just curious for any of y'all's thoughts about that.
I think that's an amazing question, and you know, maybe it just like hits my interest so directly that it gets me excited. But what's interesting is that with the language of abolition and the language of making police and prisons obsolete directly parallels this older language of revolution and of what was called the disappearance of the state, the withering away of the state, right? The idea was like, maybe you need to take power in the short term, but ultimately that state power is going to disintegrate. But it will only disintegrate when the society has been changed, right? And this is abolitionists. This is abolitionist to the core, because as long as there are social inequalities, there's going to be someone to patrol those inequalities, right? As long as there are rich people and poor people, there's going to be some people protecting the rich people. As long as there are racial inequalities, there's going to be someone upholding those. As long as there are gendered inequalities, you're going to have bullies wearing uniforms doing this kind of work. And so the point is, on the one hand, seizing power is one thing, but shifting that power toward the transformation of the entirety of society is the essence of abolition.
Okay. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, this is Dustin. So to kind of piggyback off of that and thinking about like at People's Hub, we focus on like the dismantle of the global far right, as well as solidarity economies and participatory governance, because understanding like that relationship between the state and the people, and as Gio just said, as long as there's like inequality, there will be somebody to control that resources or means of production, right? So a solidarity economy like offers us like a different type of way of building economy, because the state is built upon racial capitalism. And I think in an ableist structure, our value is intrinsically tied to like what we can produce, or for profiteers just generally, right? In the times in which we can't produce, like labor or value is literally extracted from our bodies. Like a nursing facility bed is like one example of that, or a prison bed is one example of that. But the participatory governance, like that takes shape in a lot of forms. Like I would say that abolitionists, like in theory, are probably socialists, Marxists, communists. But I think we can kind of like figure out what type of a state or democratic structure we want. But the goal is to abolish the state. And by when we say the state, it's not just the prisons, the police. They are like foot soldiers for a larger imperialist structure. So a part of like police abolition in Pittsburgh has to be like the ending of the deadly exchange and the programs that exist between Israel and the state police of Pennsylvania, or even the Pittsburgh police, right? Like to understand that surveillance technology that is weaponized and used on Palestinians is the same thing that bolsters the state and its ability to do those things here. So when we think about the abolition, it is that. But then the thing that the United States gains power on is from like that intervention of 800 something military bases across the world, and the control of resources. So the solidarity economy like solutions offers us like a way to control our resources in a local way. So whatever government system that we end upon, like I think we probably need one. It needs to be local control of resources, and I think that's also the thing that gets us to a just transition, where we could actually like have a planet that we could survive on as humans.
That's right.
I was just gonna say, we want to abolish the state, because everything is connected, from prisons and jails to policing to healthcare to housing to environmental. All of those aspects are interconnected. People might think, oh, it's a couple bad apples here and there. No, all that stuff works how it's supposed to. Healthcare is not good here for Black women, Black people in general. It's some worse in this country as well. So you can't tell me that's not connected. You can't tell me the mentality and the history is not connected. Like the whole history of gynecology was found from abusing Black women and enslaved Black women. So you can't tell me things aren't connected in some shape or form. And those doctors who do bad things to people of color, specifically Black people, and their offices, and getting housing, and not putting grocery stores near the hood. You can't tell me that isn't interconnected, and that is done on purpose. Like that system is built to be like that. They don't fund the communities for that reason. They don't have certain things in our community for that, and even trying to find a doctor that looks like me, yeah, good luck. So, they make it like that. So whenever we talk about abolishing the state, we have to look at all aspects and not just, um, jails, prisons, and police. And even when you say Black Lives Matter, people just think of police brutality as a Black person being killed. It's much more than that too. It's getting racially profiled. It's being suspicious. It's looking like the person they're trying to get. It's using artificial intelligence as well, and twisting that to be racist as well. There's many aspects, and not everybody understands how everything overlaps. And when it comes to abolishing the state, because everything does need to be replaced for a more just system, because it's never going to be reformed enough. We already went over how things are going to be replaced, and like I said before, it's just miseducation. And I feel like the sooner we realize that, the sooner we locally understand what's going on in our backyards, then we can move forward. But until then, we're just going to be stuck in this loop. And I feel like, after today, hopefully people viewing can really, dig deep in what's going on in our backyard. People dying in prisons, people, and even the crimes, it's only what's reported. People who write the reports can say whatever they want. So think about that aspect as well. But yeah, we stop talking now.
No, good.
Yeah, that's
good. That's good. Well, I'm not sure, Dad, if you're going to say something on that.
I mean, I'll just hop on to say that, abolition, it requires the abolition of the state as well. That's not like an option or like an optional add-on. That's a requirement to get there. So, I mean, I don't think I can say anything additional because everyone had such great responses, but I'll just add on that and hop off now.
Okay. Well, we're starting to wrap, if folks have any last thoughts they'd like to share, or some points they'd like to address, or a question they want to ask, one of each, someone here on the panel, we'll start to wrap up. And if folks feel like they've all said all they have to say, you could just, give a thumbs up. And
I was just gonna say that since last year, I feel like the amount of people in the streets and being active and wanting to hold people accountable and make change has been kind of like a trend to people. Everyone's like, oh yeah, Black Lives Matter this year. But if that many people said Black Lives Matter this year, we wouldn't be in the same place over a year later, really. So really just staying consistent when it comes to abolition and wanting to get these human rights in order, because everybody likes to say this is political, Black Lives Matter, political abolition, this and that is political, or call me whatever. You know, like no, this is human rights stuff. You know, we're talking about people's lives here, and a lot of people don't care until it affects them. But that's not how it should be, because these are our neighbors, people we live next door to. You know what I'm saying? You got to really think outside of your box about this type of stuff. And, you know, if you need help getting involved with stuff, I'm pretty sure all of us will be happy to assist you in doing that. You know, we all in our own little groups or whatever. So we can easily help you get involved in what your nick might be, you know what I'm saying? But maybe you're not good at like being in the street, you know how to write articles, or you can design something, graphics for something like that, or donating something for a certain type of drive. You know, not everything isn't for everybody. So just finding what you're good at and how you can contribute to the movement. Because one quote I live by former Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm, service is the rent we pay for the privilege of living on this earth, which I take as, you know, service, doing what is right is what we should be doing as we live on this earth. You know, looking out for each other, having each other's back, calling out things when needs to be called out, changing things when needs to be changed. And that's what we're trying to do. So, yeah.
Appreciate that. All right. I see you leading forward, Dolly. Is that you're going to add anything there? Okay. Well, I just want to thank you all. It's really been great to listen to you and to learn from what you have to say. Faith, Dustin, Dolly, Gio, we appreciate it. I appreciate it. And I definitely appreciate the Alliance for Police Accountability giving the platform. And so I want to really just invite folks to look at the resources. Everyone here is connected to resources. Look, go. I'm sure their bios are in the chat. Follow them. They all have very, I think, compelling bios and ways to learn just through just connecting to their links online. So thanks everybody, and have a great rest of your evening.